In the heart of the 18th century, at the pinnacle of a vast and powerful empire, a storm was gathering, not one of thunder and rain alone, but a tempest within the mind of a monarch. This is the story of King George III, a man defined by duty, power, and a mysterious affliction that would threaten to unravel not only his reign, but the very fabric of the British monarchy. Before the darkness descended, King George III was the embodiment of stability. He ascended to the throne a young, determined ruler, committed to his nation and his family. He was known as Farmer George, a monarch who took a keen interest in agriculture and science, a devout husband and a father to 15 children. Under his watch, the British Empire stretched across continents, its influence unparalleled. He was a symbol of strength and piety, a king who began his reign with the promise of a glorious new era. His court was a model of domestic virtue, a stark contrast to the decadence of his predecessors. He was a dutiful king, a steady hand on the tiller of a global superpower. But in the quiet corridors of power, the first whispers of a storm began to stir. Subtle at first, they were dismissed as mere eccentricities. The king's handwriting, once so precise, became a frantic, almost illegible scrawl. He would talk for hours without pause, his thoughts racing ahead of his words. There were sleepless nights spent pacing the halls of Windsor, his mind a whirlwind of agitation that his attendants could neither comprehend nor calm. These were not the actions of a king in control. They were the first tremors of an earthquake, deep within his mind, signaling a catastrophic shift that was about to take place. The pressure mounted relentlessly. Across the Atlantic, the American colonies, once the jewels in the imperial crown, were ablaze with the spirit of revolution. The war was a profound personal and political blow to the king. He viewed the loss of the colonies not just as a geopolitical defeat, but as a failure of his sacred duty to hold the empire together. The stress was immense, a constant, gnawing weight on his already fragile mind. As the empire fractured, so did his grip on reality. The man who had once commanded continents now struggled to command his own thoughts, retreating further into the shadows of his palace and his mind. Then, in the autumn of 1788, the storm broke in all its fury. The king's madness was no longer a secret whispered in palace hallways, it was a public crisis. His behavior became alarmingly erratic. He would speak ceaselessly for hours, his conversations leaping from one unrelated topic to another, his voice growing hoarse. He reportedly addressed an oak tree in Windsor Great Park as the King of Prussia. A curious physical symptom emerged. His urine was said to be a faint blue or purple, a bizarre clue that baffled his physicians. The steadfast monarch had vanished, replaced by a confused and tormented man, lost in a labyrinth of his own mind. The medical establishment of the 18th century was utterly unprepared for such a case. The king's doctors, armed with archaic theories and primitive methods, descended upon him. Their attempts to cure him were brutal. He was subjected to restraining chairs, harsh blistering agents applied to his skin, and icy baths, all intended to shock his system back to sanity. He was purged and bled, treatments based more on tradition than on science. These weren't cures, they were tortures inflicted upon a king who was powerless to resist. In his moments of clarity, George was painfully aware of his condition, making the experience all the more terrifying. The king's collapse created a power vacuum that threw the government into chaos. A bitter political battle erupted between the Prime Minister, William Pitt the Younger, who sought to protect the king's authority, and the opposition led by Charles James Fox. Fox was a close ally of the king's eldest son, the Prince of Wales, who was eager to be declared regent and seize power for himself. Parliament debated the regency crisis for months. The stability of the nation hung in the balance, entirely dependent on the mental state of one man. Whispers turned to public debate, and the private suffering of the king became a national spectacle. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the crisis ended. In early 1789, against all odds and the predictions of his doctors, King George began to recover. The frantic energy subsided, his speech returned to normal, and his mind cleared. The news was met with an outpouring of public joy and relief. Thanksgiving services were held across the country, and the king was celebrated as a symbol of national resilience. For a time, it seemed the storm had passed for good. The king resumed his duties. The regency bill was abandoned, and a semblance of normalcy returned to the court. The mad king was once again the beloved father of his people. But the peace was not to last. For decades, the king enjoyed periods of relative health, but the specter of his illness always lingered. In 1810, following the death of his youngest and most beloved daughter, Princess Amelia, the darkness returned, this time for good. The relapse was swift and devastating. The aging monarch descended into a profound and permanent state of mental derangement. He was now confined entirely to his apartments at Windsor Castle, a king in name only. The regency that was so fiercely debated years earlier was now an unavoidable reality, and his son finally became Prince Regent in 1811. The final decade of King George's life was one of tragic isolation. His mind was gone, lost to a fog from which he would never emerge. His world shrank further as he was consumed by physical ailments. He became completely blind and increasingly deaf. He would wander the halls of Windsor, a ghostly figure in a velvet gown, playing his harpsichord and holding imaginary conversations with long-dead ministers and angels. The once powerful ruler of a global empire was now a prisoner in his own home, a lonely old man oblivious to the world outside, unaware that his nation was fighting Napoleon or that his beloved wife, Queen Charlotte, had passed away. King George III died in January 1820 at the age of 81. He had been king for nearly 60 years, one of the longest reigns in British history. For his last 9 years, he had been a phantom monarch, his throne empty, his kingdom ruled by another. His legacy is complex. He is remembered as the king who lost America, but also as a monarch of great personal integrity, and, of course, for his madness. Today, Many historians and medical experts believe he suffered from porphyria, a genetic blood disorder whose symptoms match his own, while others point to bipolar disorder. The madness of King George was not a moral failing but a medical tragedy. Misunderstood by the age in which he lived, it's a story of the fragility of the human mind, even one that wears a crown.